guys, welcome to my channel. My name is ReadingBear and I hope you are ready for some more stories. And today, we will take a look at some new Just No HOA content. If you enjoyed my content, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and post some bear emojis in the comment. And now, let's dive right into the stories.
First one is titled, When Evil Mama Bear Tried to Restart the HOA. Now, the neighborhood my mother's house is in had an HOA that was disbanded in the early 90s for the pretty stereotypical reasons. Corrupt leaders, misappropriation of funds, etc. I really don't have many details on it since I was very little when it went down. But my mother had apparently been openly aiming for a seat on the HOA council for years. So she was really sore when the HOA was gone because she could no longer run for a position. Fast forward to 1999. Evil Mama Bear had been trying to quote the old HOA covenants to the neighborhood for years and insisted that the rules and regulations set forth when the HOA was active should still be abided by. Literally, no one wanted to listen to her. My mother started putting flyers around the neighborhood that detailed she was restarting the HOA without their approval and would be its first new president. The neighbors ended up in an uproar over this and showed up to her public meeting. And there she was verbally ripped to shreds as nearly every single homeowner in the neighborhood not only denied their support of another HOA but also made it clear to her what she was trying to do was not legal. My mother was incensed by this, and no surprise she didn't even have my father's support, which was something she'd initially been counting on. But he refused from the onset of her scheme. And when the neighborhood all refused to recreate the HOA, Evil Mama Bear went off on my dad for not being supportive of her. After she gaslighted herself into nearly being out of breath, my dad told her she was just looking for a way to lord over the neighborhood, and he'd never support that. She tried to argue with him some more, but he just ended the conversation and walked away. Somehow, that still didn't stop my mother, though. She went and contacted a sleazy lawyer about trying to get the HOA running again without the support of the residents. Her hope was that there was some sort of law that could reactivate the HOA on different grounds. The lawyer went through all of the old HOA documents and state laws over a couple of days and told my mother there was nothing that could be done as it was not enforceable, and that without the consent and signed support of enough people in the neighborhood, there was no way to legally restart the HOA. Then proceeded to bill Evil Mama Bear for the time he spent looking through all of that. Since my mother hired the sleazy lawyer herself under the table, she had to pay him. But she hated paying anyone for anything because she was so cheap. Now, an important fact of note was that my dad hadn't trusted Evil Mama Bear with his money for years and no longer kept joint bank accounts with her. And she had no way to access his money. She filed for a new credit card using his name and then used a TED credit card to pay the lawyer instead. My dad noticed a new credit card statement in his name pretty fast and nearly filed for fraud when my mother came clean out of fear. He demanded she pay off the credit card and then have said card deactivated. My mother didn't want to, but he threatened to call the fraud department of his bank on her. I still remember hearing the argument where she tried to claim that he couldn't do that because they were married, and everything that was his was also hers, and that meant that she could do what she did, and he'd still have to pay. Dad called BS on that and said he'd contest the charges and get the card removed from his name, which would have left my mother in serious legal trouble for fraud and debt collection. And so Evil Mama Bear begrudgingly paid off the money owed. And my dad cut the card to little pieces with scissors. My mother had the money to pay the lawyer all along. She just preferred to keep her cash and put any expenses she could on my father. But he always stopped her, and she tried to pull the shared assets logic because they were married, though that ended when they divorced. Evil Mama Bear still spent the next few years trying to quote the HOA covenants to neighbors, but she was always dismissed or laughed at every single time she tried. A few people started referring to her as President Wannabe. To this day, no HOA has formed in the neighborhood again, and even if one did, they'd never vote in Evil Mama Bear. I can only imagine what would happen if she tried to pull this crap in Texas after she moves there. Edit. I've had a few people messaging me that the lawyer I spoke of in the story that my mother went to wasn't sleazy just by association with my mother, and just did what normal lawyers do. Well, he was known by reputation to overcharge people. And my own lawyer told me some time ago that he had first-hand experience with the sleazy lawyer because he knew him in person. The guy would intentionally take longer than needed to do anything so he could charge more time from clients. That, among other shady things, he did bite him in the butt some years ago, and he shut down his office. Next one is titled, You can't put a lien on a house not in your community. T has happened years ago when I was in elementary school, so maybe 15 years ago, and I was living in Florida at the time. Anyone who lives in Florida knows how often new gated communities just pop up. Our neighborhood was established, and has been before I even moved into the house. That house once belonged to my uncle. We had a neighborhood watch, but no HOA. The gated community was finally built, and people were moving in. Now, we don't have a bad neighborhood, but we had some strange colored houses. Lime green and magenta with giant metal lizards hanging all over it is an example of one. Our house was simple, hand brick and half concrete painted white. It stood out compared to some of the other houses. The new gated community is a HOA community, and they thought they ruled over all. Soon people in our neighborhood were receiving fines for their house color choices, their unsightly cars, not approved mailboxes, and other nitpicky things. My parents received some for my dad's, boat being in the driveway, and even our unruly yard. We had a bougainvillea, which grows like crazy, and we were constantly trimming it. And we even got a fine for our fence. The old fence was chain link, and the new fence was a wooden privacy fence. Don't ask why we had two different fences. My uncle only fenced in part of the house. It was still good fence, so my dad didn't want to rip it out. Well, my mom and dad would just pitch anything they saw coming from that gated community as they had fancy stationery. This went on for maybe 4 or 5 months. We would receive fines for not meeting HOA standards and other violations. We talked to our neighbors, and they received them too. They tried to call and complain, but were given the runaround and decided to pitch the mail as well. My mom received a phone call from her bank. They started to question her about the lien on the house that just appeared in the system. My parents had less than a year left on their payments for the house. They always paid extra every month for the house loan and were always in time. My mom was super confused and said there shouldn't be a lien. We don't have reason for there to be a lien. Turns out the gated community filed liens on almost every house in my neighborhood. My mom told the bank the situation and called a lawyer. I'm not all sure what happened, but I know a lot of the members of that HOA faced felony fraud charges, and it was a just huge mess with a pretty big lawsuit against the HOA board. We were able to pay off the house after the lawsuit. We even had a big celebration on one of the roads, a huge cookout, and we met people we didn't know before. I'd even made new friends with some kids that I didn't even know existed. People moved out of the gated community due to bad press, and a lot of the houses stood empty for a long time. When I moved away, there were still a lot of houses empty, and it was like a ghost town. Last I heard, the name of the community changed and the houses were being filled up. I guess the lesson is, leave our bright houses alone and mind your own business. Next one is titled, HOA Representative Delays Apartment Renovations, Costing Apartment Its Warranty. I, 28 male, am in Canada, am working on an apartment in which we have had multiple meetings with the local HOA to get approvals for how the material looks, color, even how it goes together. I work in architectural sheet metal, so I won't throw a whole lot of jargon at you. Anyways, we have been working on this building for about 2 months. Made it up to the 6th floor, securing the cap metal with standing seams, wing clip, and smash pins. When the HOA representative comes out onto the scaffolding and promptly says, "Take off all the cap flashing. I don't like the standing seams because it runs my view and the views of the residents. Don't you know this is a luxury apartment?" My boss and I both looked dumbfounded, and I said that to the representative, "I'm sorry, but this is a part of local laws on securement of the metal. If you didn't like this should have been brought up during the meeting with the architect, the head contractor. This building is as old as I am, clearly was not built to standard. And if you are a construction worker like I am, you would clearly see it just by looking at the building's concrete." After the HOA representative left, we went to talk with the head contractor, in which he laughed his butt off. Told us not to worry about it since the HOA is already into it for a good $1 million and would cost them another $50K to remove the siding, take out our metal, pay for new metal, install it, then reinstall the siding to get it to the way he wants it. A day later, we get a phone call from the owner saying that they are going to pay for it. But the way they want it, absolutely no standing seams, is going to cost the building its 10-year warranty on the metal. Meaning that if anything happens after we leave the building, it's not our problem. A user in the comments said, "Make sure to send them this with the upgraded quote and let them reply with an assent first. That way, when it invariably falls off after 8 years, or the first good storm, you can reply to the warranty claim from the insurer with the attestation. Or even better, involve the insurer that you are voiding the warranty on the work, due to them not wanting it installed correctly, and see just how fast the backpedal when being told the cladding now no longer is covered under the policy, and they will be liable for any damages relating to it failing. Last one is titled, HOA and the City Contract. Aka how the HOA got fined. Some quick backstory to this. I don't live with an HOA, thank the divines, but I have had dealings with them. I studied environmental engineering in college and have a degree with a specialization in water treatment systems. Normally, though, that's not my day job. Even so, recently, a friend of mine who works with one of the neighboring cities asked me if I wouldn't mind doing some tests for water pollution in a waterfowl preservation area. There had been some strange die-off events going on, and the city was trying to figure out where the source of the pollution was coming from. I'd be operating under a special contract from the city, and was given access to any location along this waterfowl area, within reason, to perform my tests. I won't go into detail about how the tests work, they're involved, and can be a pain in the butt, but suffice it to say that I started taking water and soil samples from likely sources along the waterfowl preserve's borders. This showed me that there was a notable number of nitrates and phosphates in the water, which I surmised was affecting the birds. Now to find the source. I followed the river up its length, passing a number of housing sites, a couple of apartments, and the odd settling pond. Over the course of several weeks and a barrage of tests, these were ruled out as sources. The further I went up the river, though, the stronger the concentrations became, to the point that it was dangerous for humans to even be in contact with the water. We're talking Superfund type pollution. This was last summer. As I waded up along this area, I heard some splashing and the sounds of kids playing in the water. Not good. Not good at all. Turning the bend, I come face to face with a small dock leading into the water, and 4 or 5 kids taking turns jumping off it into the water. The heavily polluted, dangerous water. There's some lady sitting on the dock watching them, and I approached her. I forget the exchange, but it boiled down to me telling her I'm from the city, and based on some of what had been found, the children were banned from swimming in the river. The lady tried arguing the point, until I told her I was calling the Marshal code enforcement to have the area barricaded off, and she could explain her complaints to him. She grabbed the kids and scuttled off. Marshal did arrive, found that the dock wasn't built with proper code standards, and condemned it, forcing the HOA who had built it to have it demolished within the week, or the city was going to do it and they'd front the bill. That still left the matter of the pollution. That's where things got weird. Once I passed this HOA subdivision, all pollution vanished. I must have done 5 or 6 further tests to verify this, but yeah, no pollution. So, I had my culprit. The next question was figuring out what they were doing. That's where my investigative side comes in. With the help of the Marshal, I started going around the properties of the HOA, talking with residents. It was a few simple questions like, do you know if they're fertilizing the grass? And when do they do this? And do you know the type of fertilizer they use? Just gathering evidence? Remember the lady from earlier? Turned out she was the HOA president. I only found this out after she called the police on the Marshal and I, reporting strange men wandering around her neighborhood. She called them something like 4 times in a day before the police flat out told her they work with the city. And if you keep calling, we're charging you. That didn't stop her from following us around in her car and taking photos with her phone. Eventually, we spoke with one older gentleman that broke the case as it were. The HOA president had been fining people for not having perfectly green grass. We were in a drought at the time, so that's no surprise there. After several of the people in the subdivision got fined by the city for watering their grass, she had taken matters into her own hand. She first tried contracting a landscaper to spray the lawns with fertilizer, but due to various EPA's regulations, he'd apparently refused. The homeowner couldn't be certain what the lady had done next, but a couple days after that, some guys turned up with a large farm-type trailer of liquid and sprayed every single foot of grass the HOA controlled, even right down to the water's edge. With the homeowner's permission, I took several soil samples from around his property, and then samples from the common area that joined the grassy area beside the river and dock. It took about a week to get full results back, but I had my answer. This lady had some contractors or someone spraying farm-grade fertilizer on the grass. This particular fertilizer is heavily controlled by the EPA and requires a special license to even possess, much less use. I presented all my evidence to my contact at the city and laid out just how serious the damage was, and that I was legally obligated to report the HOA to the State Regulatory Board for gross violations. My contract took the papers and paid me for my services, thanking me but also noting that if this went to court, I would need to testify about my findings. Epilogue: the court was originally scheduled for March of 2020, but it never came to that. The HOA president entered a plea deal with the state where she and the HOA was required to pay for the environmental cleanup of the river, as well as restitution to the state. The fines alone topped close to $250,000, and the cleanup, still ongoing, is expected to break $1 million itself. The HOA president got the boot, while the HOA itself was, last I heard, facing being dissolved by the state due to multiple cases of negligence and inept management. I don't know how they came in contact with that fertilizer, though I suspect some of the charges against the HOA president had something to do with that. Want to know the sad thing, though? If the HOA had simply contacted the city or the state, they would have been given a list of approved fertilizers to use, which both wouldn't have polluted the surrounding water and wouldn't have put them on the hook for an environmental disaster. The number is right on the city and state's website. The HOA just couldn't be bothered to look it up. A user in the comments said, "It reminds me of a time where a friend of mine got in trouble with his new neighbors. He bought a house in the neighborhood, and the county came out to do an inspection. They did a dye test on his septic system, and it showed up in a pond. So they tested all the neighbors. They all showed up in the pond. He was persona non grata for some time afterwards. If he hadn't bought the house, they could have gone on dumping their sewage into the pond instead of installing new septic systems." Thanks for listening.